This is lecture 4 on Kant's philosophy of the self in the critique of pure reason. I still have to talk about chapter 2. The chapter 2 was inner sense and the self in itself. But as I said in lecture 3, I have to talk about Transcendental Aesthetic. Now, my writing, Kant's philosophy of self, is based on the transcendental deduction of the categories, which is the core of the critique of pure reason. And but I think I should talk about Transcendental Aesthetic, in which Kant talks about space and time. And Kant says that space and time are pure forms of intuition. And he talks about all kinds of intuition: sensible intuition, pure forms of sensible intuition, pure intuition, non-sensible intuition, intellectual intuition, and so on and so forth. Now, in the Transcendental Aesthetic, he deals with space and time. He begins with his exposition of space. Now, he says that in B60 that space and time are its pure forms. Sensation in general, it's matter. Now, everything is composed of matter and form. Since Aristotle, the everything have formal cause and material cause, like the desk. Its form is the shape of desk. Its matter is wood, or maybe it could be plastic. And even our knowledge or cognition is composed of form and matter. And for the matter of representations is sensation, and form of representations is space and time. Because Kant draws a distinction appearance reality. All his philosophy is based on the appearance reality distinction, or phenomena noumena dichotomy. And everything has to appear somewhere, sometime, or everything has to appear somewhere and somewhen. So, in order for things to appear, space and time must be presupposed. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to appear. They wouldn't be able to represent themselves. They're represented in space and time. And Kant starts talking about, Kant begins the aesthetic with exposition of space. And I might not have enough time to talk about time today. It's kind of odd to say I don't have time to talk about time, but Kant begins his argument from space and not time. So if I spend maybe 20 minutes or half hour on space, I might not be able to go into time. Now, about there are many philosophers and scientists also who thought about space. And for Isaac Newton, space is like a container. Newton thought there was an absolute space, because things must be in space. And plus, he was concerned with motion of bodies, so that thinking about regarding space as a container is it's very natural. And plus, Newton is a scientist, not a philosopher. He never thought about space philosophically. So it is really common sense that in order for things to move around, there must be a space. I mean, and in order for things to move around, there must be empty space. Otherwise, if there were no empty space between the bodies, I mean, they can't move around. For things to move around, there must be a space or extra space or room. That's what he thought. And Leibniz thought that is wrong. I mean, space is really mind-dependent. For Newton, space is absolute. It's like a container, as I said. But Leibniz, who is a philosopher, not quite a he's a philosopher of science, but he thought about space philosophically too. And space is a form of coexistence substances. And as Leibniz wrote the monadology, he's concerned about the monads. Now, well, there's some relation, I think, between Leibniz monads and Kant's noumena. Well, that's what I think. Actually, I asked Bob Slay, expert of Leibniz, and who was also on the committee of my thesis, that do you think there's a relation between Leibniz monads and Kant's noumena? Slay goes, "Oh yes, I think so. Oh, that's a good point." And I said, well, I'd like to talk about about that, but he just said, "Oh, I'm pretty busy now, and I can't really talk about it." And I met him like 3 months after I brought up the topic on the Leibniz monads and Kant's noumena. But when I saw him, he just said, "Oh, I just forgot." Well, Robert Paul Wolff was chairman of my thesis committee, and Robert Slay was a member of the committee, and he's an expert on Leibniz, and he agreed with me that there's some resemblance between Leibniz monads and Kant's noumena, but he didn't really have a chance to talk about that with me. Well, anyway, Leibniz, who also thought about the appearance reality. I mean, for someone like Isaac Newton, he was never concerned about the appearance reality distinction. So, I mean, for things, he was only concerned about the appearances, i.e. the bodies. And in order for bodies to be, the bodies have to be somewhere, so the bodies have to be in space. And in order for bodies to move around, there must be empty space. That's what Isaac Newton thought. And Leibniz thought, well, who's concerned about the appearance reality distinction? And he talks about the monads, which are spiritual, not physical atoms. For Leibniz, the space is a form of coexistent substances. and he thought there's no space which is mind dependent. Excuse me, there cannot be mind which is independent of mind. That's what Leibniz thought. But Newton thought the space can exist independent of the mind. Leibniz thought, no. There can be no space apart from the mind. And Kant, who tried to mediate between the two, came up with his own conclusion that empty space is not necessary, but it's possible. See, for Newton, empty space is necessary, and for Leibniz, empty space is impossible. But for Kant, empty space is not necessary, but possible. That's what he says, I think, in B39 of the Transcendental Aesthetic. It says, one can never represent that there is no space, though one can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. You cannot say there's no space, but there can be empty space. So I just wrote them. Maybe this is easier. So, can you say this? For Newton, empty space is necessary. Leibniz, empty space is impossible. For Kant, empty space is possible. That being said, actually there was a Leibniz clock correspondence in which they argued about space. And one should read it, and if you're interested in it. Plus, in the 20th century, there was a debate between Jacob Hintiger, distinguished Finnish mathematician, and Charles Parsons, who was professor of philosophy at Columbia and Harvard. And I think the debate between Hintiger and Parsons is just as great as the Leibniz clock correspondence. So like Hintiger Parsons debate is like a 20th century Leibniz clock correspondence, and one should really look into it. But also, P.F. Strawson in the last chapter of The Bounds of Sense, P.F. Strawson wrote about the geometry, and there he talks about the intuition. And I think if Hintiger, Parsons, and Strawson, if they had a trilateral debate, it would have been very great. But it didn't take place. And even though among the people who like the Strawson, who agrees with the Strawson for saying transcendental idealism is just academic fantasy, even those people don't pay much attention to his theory on geometry, because his chapter on geometry is in the really at the end of The Bounds of Sense, and some people don't really pay attention to it. But I think his theory of geometry is very good, and I wish there were trilateral debate among Hintiger, Parsons, and Strawson. Actually, Charles Paulson was also a student of C.I. Lewis, and he was a classmate of Robert Paul Wolff, who directed my thesis. Anyway, what is intuition? As I said, space and time are pure forms of intuition. And when Kant says space is pure intuition, he often means just pure form of intuition, pure form of sensible intuition. But he sometimes, it's just pure intuition often is an abbreviation of pure form of intuition. But sometimes he said, well, that's space is pure form of intuition, but it's also pure intuition itself. That's hard to understand, but since I'm not a philosopher of science, I'm not an expert of philosophy of space and time, I can't go too deeply into the difference between pure form of intuition, pure intuition, but I talk about all types of intuition. Now, as we human beings have senses like eyes, nose, ears, we can see, we can hear, we can smell, we can taste, we can touch. Those are the senses. And our intuition is sensible intuition. We intuit through sense. And we do not have non-sensible intuition. Now, Kant often says we human beings have only sensible intuition, and we do not have non-sensible intuition. So the readers sometimes wonder, wait, Kant said space and time are pure form of intuition and pure intuition. If it is necessary for us to have space, or if it is necessary for the space to be mind dependent, and if space is pure intuition, why does Kant says human being never have a non-sensible intuition? Human being must have pure intuition. Well, one may not confuse pure intuition with non-sensible intuition. I mean, pure intuition and non-sensible intuition are absolutely different. They really have no relation to each other. Now, when Kant says non-sensible intuition, that means intellectual intuition. And we human beings do not have intellectual intuition. Who does? Okay? Only a divine being, that is God. Now, we human beings have only sensible intuition, and it is the divine being, God, who has intellectual intuition. So when Kant says non-sensible intuition, he means intellectual intuition and not pure intuition. That's what you have to keep in mind. And also, he talks about the beings other than human beings whose forms are not space and time. For us, human beings, forms of space and time are, forms of human intuition are space and time, but there might be beings other than human beings whose forms are not space and time, like angels, fairies. There might be fairies around here, or E.T. Those are the beings whose forms of intuition not, or whose forms of intuition may not be space and time. But since they're not God, They don't have non-sensible intuition. They don't have intellectual intuition. See, angel might be a coordinator or messenger from God. Angel might coordinate between divine being and human being. But they're not God. So they may have forms of intuition which are different from human beings, but since they're not God, they don't have non-sensible intuition. They don't have intellectual intuition. Now, since a human being does not have intellectual intuition, we cannot know things in themselves because we can know only appearances. We can know only sensible objects. And in order for things to be intuited, it must be given our senses. Now, I was wondering what if only intuition we have is sensible intuition. What is really the difference between sensation and intuition? I mean, if you put sensation and intuition together, that's the sensible intuition. What really is the distinction? And I asked this question to Jay Garfield, who's a professor of philosophy and who's head of the Department of Philosophy at Smith College now. I asked him this question back in the 80s, and he said, all right, human eyes have both sensation and intuition, but lens of camera, I mean, like the camera is right in front of me, the lens of camera has sense, but it doesn't have intuition. Someone who invented a camera, or someone who invented a camera lens, tried to analyze the structure of the human eyes, and created or invented the lens of camera. But according to Jay Garfield, lens of camera can sense, but it cannot intuit. Human eyes can sense and intuit. So that's the difference between sensation and intuition. I think that's a very good way to explain those things. Now, these days we talk about AI, artificial intelligence. Lots of things the AI do, artificial intelligence. But can the AI replace human beings? Well, to some extent, they can calculate very fast and they can do all kinds of things. But does AT have intuition? I don't think so. AT stands for artificial intelligence, not artificial intuition. So I say, as Jay Garfield said more than 30 years ago, AT can think, AT can do things, but AI, AI cannot intuit, because AI is artificial intelligence and not artificial intuition. Now, since Jay Garfield was a professor of philosophy, but he also teaches cognitive science, and what he said about the difference between sensation and intuition, what he said about the difference between lens of camera and human eyes is very applicable to today's studies about artificial intelligence. So that we have to remember that space and time are pure forms of intuition, and when Kant says non-sensible intuition. That has nothing to do with pure intuition. And non-sensible intuition is possessed only by God. So non-sensible intuition is intellectual intuition, which is creative intuition, and which it is also divine intuition. That's what we have to know. Well, what else should I say about the intuition? But to understand the Kant's philosophy of self, or to understand the transcendental deduction of the categories, all you have to know is space and time are pure forms of sensible intuition. You don't have to understand pure form, space and time are pure intuition. In order to understand Kant's philosophy of mathematics, you have to be an expert on the pure intuition. But just to understand the transcendental deduction of categories, all you have to know is space and time are pure forms of a sensible intuition, and you really don't have to understand what the difference between pure intuition and pure form of intuition. You just have to remember that pure intuition is not intellectual intuition. Okay. Okay. I was going to talk about chapter 2. The rest of chapter 2. Inner sense and the self in itself. Since I spent more than 25 minutes on space. I think I should end today's lecture here, and I'll talk about the chapter 2 of the Kant's philosophy of self in my next lecture, lecture 5. I mean, if I talk about intuition and also chapter 2 in the same lecture, people might just get confused. I just want to explain a few things about intuition, and I try to explain the difference among all the kinds of intuition. I hope you could see those differences. So I'll talk about chapter 2 in lecture 5.